There is a particular quality to the light in Rome as the afternoon begins to soften into evening. A warm amber that settles over the rooftops and the terracotta tiles like a slow exhale. As though the city itself has been holding its breath through the long, hot hours of the day and is only now beginning to let it go. The shadows stretch out long and lazy from the columns and the archways, reaching across the stone-paved streets in unhurried lines. And the air, which has been thick and close with the heat of so many thousands of bodies going about their business, begins to carry just the faintest suggestion of coolness from somewhere far away. Perhaps from the hills to the east. Perhaps simply from the turning of the hours. This is the time when the bathhouses of the city begin to fill with a particular kind of noise. Not the sharp and urgent sounds of commerce and negotiation that have filled the streets since early morning, but something rounder and more relaxed. A low murmur of voices echoing off warm stone walls. The soft splash of water. The occasional burst of easy laughter rolling up through the vaulted ceilings and dispersing gently into the steam. The baths in a city like Rome are not merely a place to wash. They are, in the most comfortable and unhurried sense, the living room of the city, the place where the day's work is set down at the door along with one's sandals, and where the evening begins in earnest. Imagine, if you can, stepping through the entrance of one of the smaller neighborhood baths. A modest establishment tucked between a bakery and a row of apartment buildings in one of the city's many residential districts. Not one of the grand imperial complexes that will come later, with their marble floors and their painted ceilings and their libraries and their gardens. But something more intimate than that. More worn and familiar, the kind of place where the attendant knows your name and where the same group of men have been meeting at the same hour for so many years that their conversation has the comfortable texture of something very old and well used. The walls are plastered and painted in deep warm colors, ochre and terracotta and a faded reddish brown. And the paint has been touched by years of steam and condensation so that it has a softness to it. A slight bloom like the skin of a ripe fruit. The furnaces beneath the floor have been burning since before midday, and the heat rises through the hollow spaces under the stone in a slow and even way, so that the floor itself is warm underfoot. Pleasantly warm, the kind of warmth that you feel first in the soles of your feet and then gradually through the whole of your body, as though the building itself is gently welcoming you in. The Romans call this the hypocaust, this ingenious arrangement of small pillars and channels that carry the heat of the fire beneath the floors and up through the walls. And there is something almost miraculous about it. The idea that warmth can travel through stone, that a fire burning in a basement room can make the floor of a bathing hall comfortable to stand on without shoes. It speaks to a certain practical ingenuity, a desire not just to wash, but to wash in comfort, to make the ordinary business of cleanliness into something that feels, for a little while, like a small luxury. The bathers move through the rooms in a natural progression. From the cooler entrance room where they undress and leave their clothing in the care of a slave or a trusted attendant, through to the warm room and then the hot room, and perhaps afterward to the cold plunge pool, which sits in its own tiled alcove and which on a warm evening like this one feels less like a shock and more like a long, cool sigh. There are slaves working here, moving quietly through the steam with towels and small vessels of olive oil, because the Romans do not wash with soap in the way that we might think of it. Instead, they oil their skin and then use a small curved tool called a strigil to scrape the oil away again, taking with it the dust and the sweat of the day. And there is something wonderfully methodical about this. Something almost meditative, the slow passage of the curved blade across the shoulder, the arm, the back of the neck. The smell of the baths in the early evening is a layered thing. Warm and slightly mineral from the heated stone and the water, with underneath it the faint sweetness of the olive oil and the sharper note of the wood smoke that drifts occasionally from the direction of the furnace rooms. And over all of it the clean, damp smell of steam, which clings to everything and makes the air feel almost soft, almost tangible, as though you could reach out and take hold of it. The sound is a constant low echo, voices and water and the occasional scrape of a strigil against tile. And it all blends together into something that is not quite silence, but is not far from it either. Something that the mind can rest inside without effort. By the time the light outside has shifted from amber to a deeper, more golden rose, the baths are at their fullest, and the conversation has settled into its evening rhythm. Men discuss the price of grain, the quality of the wine at a particular tavern near the forum, the progress of a building project on the next street, the small navigable concerns of daily life in a large and busy city. There is no great urgency to any of it. The voices rise and fall in the steam like something floating on warm water, and the words themselves matter less than the fact of the conversation, the companionable presence of other people at the end of a long day, the sense that the day's particular weight is being gently dissolved by the heat and the water and the easy company. Children sometimes appear at the baths in the early evening hours, brought by older siblings or by household slaves, and they move through the warm rooms with a different energy than the adults, quick and curious and occasionally noisy, until the heat and the steam and the lateness of the hour begin to work on them in the way that warmth always works on small children, slowing them down, making their movements heavier and more deliberate, until they are leaning against a wall or sitting on the warm floor with the particular boneless quality of a child who is nearly asleep but has not quite admitted it yet. A slave will gather them up eventually, wrapping them in a length of cloths, carrying them out into the cooling evening air. And they will not wake, or if they do, it will only be for a moment, just long enough to register the smell of the street and the sound of the city before settling back down into sleep. The baths begin to empty as the light outside fades from rose to a deep and dusty purple, the color of the sky just before the stars become visible. And the emptying is gradual and unhurried, people drifting out in ones and twos rather than all at once, pausing at the entrance to put their sandals back on, exchanging a last few words with an acquaintance, stepping out into the street with clean skin and loose limbs and the particular pleasant tiredness that comes from having spent an hour or two in warm water. The air outside feels noticeably cooler now. Not cold, not on a summer evening in Rome, but cool enough to be refreshing against skin that has been warmed by the baths. And there is a moment, stepping from the warmth into the open air, that feels like a kind of gentle waking up, a soft return to the world. The streets around the bathhouse have a different character in the evening than they do during the day. The market stalls that line the pavements since early morning have mostly packed away their goods, and the spaces they occupied have a slightly hollow look. The stones a little cleaner where the awnings kept off the dust, the air a little emptier. But the food vendors are still out, and will be for some hours yet, the small portable braziers sending up thin threads of fragrant smoke. The smell of grilled sausage and flatbread, and something spiced that is difficult to name but instantly recognizable. The smell of an evening street in a city where most people do not have kitchens of their own, and where the evening meal is something purchased and carried home or eaten standing at a counter. The apartment buildings that line these streets. The great stacked insulae that house most of the city's enormous population are beginning to show their evening faces. Here and there a lamp has been lit in an upper window, and the light it casts is warm and small and slightly wavering. The light of an oil lamp burning in a clay vessel. A light that has a color to it that is closer to amber than to yellow. Softer and more intimate than anything we might produce today. The smell of lamp oil drifts down occasionally from the upper floors. A slightly sharp, slightly animal smell that is nonetheless familiar and not unpleasant. The smell of a household settling in for the night. These buildings are tall by the standards of the ancient world, rising 4 or 5 or even 6 stories in some cases. And they are built close together, so that the streets between them are narrow and the upper floors almost seem to lean toward one another across the gap. Close enough in some places that a person reaching out from an upper window might nearly touch the building opposite. The ground floors tend to house shops and workshops. Their wide fronts open to the street during the day and shuttered now with wooden panels. And above them the apartments are stacked in tiers. Each floor a little smaller and a little less desirable than the one below. Because climbing stairs is work, and because the higher you go the further you are from the water supply and the further you have to carry everything you need. The most prosperous tenants live on the lower floors, in rooms that are larger and better appointed, with access to the courtyard and the fountain. Higher up, the rooms are smaller and the walls thinner, and in winter the cold comes through more easily. And in summer, the heat of the sun on the roof tiles makes the upper floors almost unbearably warm. But on an evening like this one, with the day's heat beginning to ease and the air moving gently through the narrow streets, the upper floors have a certain appeal. You can see more from up there, the rooftops and the distant hills, the smoke from the furnaces of the baths still rising in a slow pale column against the darkening sky, the first stars appearing one by one in the deep blue overhead. The city spreads out in every direction, an almost incomprehensible density of buildings and people. And from a high window it resolves itself into something almost beautiful. The warm lights appearing in windows across the distance like a scattered field of small flames. The sound of the city rising up in a low and continuous murmur that is not unlike the sound of a very large and very slow river. Down in the streets, the bathers who have finished for the evening are making their way home through the gathering dusk. Their footsteps unhurried on the stone. Their voices quiet. Some will stop at a thermopolium, one of the many small establishments that line the streets of Roman residential neighborhoods, where large ceramic vessels are set into a stone counter and kept warm over charcoal, and where a person can purchase a cup of warm wine or a bowl of something thick and savory, a stew of lentils or chickpeas or whatever the cook has prepared that day. The counters of these places are worn smooth by years of elbows and hands, and the walls behind them are often painted with cheerful scenes. A garden, a peacock, a hunting dog. And the light inside is warm and low, and the smell is of wine and spices, and the particular comfortable smell of a room that has been heated by cooking fires for a very long time. The evening meal, for most Romans living in these apartment buildings, is not a formal or elaborate thing. It is eaten sitting or reclining, often with family or with the other tenants of the same floor. The food shared from common vessels. The conversation easy and unremarkable. The kind of talk that fills the space between the end of the day's work and the beginning of sleep without demanding very much of anyone. There is bread almost certainly. The dense and slightly sour bread that comes from the bakeries that are scattered through every neighborhood of the city. And there is olive oil for dipping. And there might be olives themselves, or a handful of dried figs, or a small amount of fish sauce stirred into something. Because fish sauce in Rome is what salt and vinegar and something deeply savory all are at once. And it goes into almost everything. The wine is mixed with water, as it always is, in a ratio that varies depending on the occasion and the preference of the drinker. But always mixed, because to drink wine unmixed is considered not quite civilized. And the resulting drink is mild enough that it settles rather than stimulates, rounding off the edges of the day rather than sharpening them. The cup is ceramic, simple and undecorated for most people. Smooth and slightly cool to the touch, even after the wine has warmed it a little. And there is something about holding it, about the weight of it in the hand and the smell of the wine rising gently from it. That is quietly satisfying in a way that is very difficult to explain and very easy to feel. And so the evening gathers itself in, and the baths cool slowly in the darkness. The fires in the furnace rooms burning low now. The water in the pools still holding its warmth, but beginning to release it gradually into the air. And the last attendant moving through the empty rooms with a lamp, checking that nothing has been left behind, that the lamps are safely extinguished, that everything is as it should be. The sound of water dripping somewhere in the cool room is the only sound now. A slow and very regular sound. Patient and unhurried, the sound of a building settling into its nighttime quiet. Outside, the streets are not yet silent. They will not be silent for some hours yet. But the quality of the sound has changed, grown softer and more intermittent. And the city is beginning, in its gradual and uneven way, to turn its face towards sleep, the way a person turns toward a pillow, not all at once, not with any great decision, but slowly by degrees, drawn by something warmer and quieter than the waking world. And so the evening settled in around the city, the way evenings do, gradually and without announcement. The light thinning from gold to amber to the soft gray-blue of cooling stone. Rome did not go dark all at once. It let itself down gently, the way a tired person lowers themselves into a chair, one part at a time, the shoulders first, then the back, then finally the whole weight of the day releasing. If you had been standing somewhere in the middle of the city on such an evening, in the 1st century, perhaps near the foot of the Aventine Hill, or along one of the wider streets that ran down toward the river, you would have noticed the insulae rising above you. These were the great apartment buildings of ancient Rome, and they were everywhere. They rose 4 stories. 5 stories, sometimes 6, their pale plaster walls catching the last of the light, while the street below had already fallen into shadow. They were not elegant in the way that marble temples were elegant. They were practical and a little worn, the way most things that house ordinary people tend to be. Their surfaces marked by weather and time, and the slow accumulation of daily life pressing against them from the inside. The word insula means island, and there was something apt about that. Something that made a quiet kind of sense. Each building stood surrounded by the flow of street life, the way an island stands in moving water. The carts and the vendors and the voices of the day swirling around its base while up above. Story by story, the residents made their separate peace with the evening. Imagine standing at the base of one of those staircases now. Not rushing, just arriving. The stone steps were worn smooth in the middle from years of feet. Thousands of feet, morning and evening, and all the hours between. And the edges were a little rougher where the wear had not reached. The original texture of the cut stone still holding there in the corners. The stairwell itself was narrow, just wide enough for two people to pass if one turned sideways and both were patient about it. And it smelled of the building's whole life at once. Of cooked food and lamp oil and damp plaster, and something faintly smoky from the braziers that residents burned in their rooms when the evenings turned cool. The ground floor of an insula was typically given over to shops. Tabernae, their wide wooden shutters folded back during the day to open the whole front of the space to the street. By this hour, the shutters were being drawn closed. The shopkeepers lifting the heavy planks back into their grooves one by one. The sound of it a soft percussion that moved along the street in no particular order. One shop and then another and then another. Each one settling closed like a book being put away. A baker might occupy one of these spaces. And even now, with the day's selling done, there would still be warmth coming from the direction of the oven. And the smell of flour and char that clings to the walls of such places long after the last loaf has been taken out. A fuller cleaning cloth might be next door, or a wine cellar with his large ceramic vessels set into the stone counter, the rims worn smooth by countless hands reaching across. The people climbing the stairs at this hour were coming home from all the various places that the day had taken them. A woman who had spent the afternoon at the fuller's, collecting a cleaned garment folded over her arm. A man who worked somewhere in the city's vast administrative machinery, carrying nothing but the day's tiredness. Children who had been out longer than they should have been. Their energy finally spent, moving up the stairs more slowly than they had come down them that morning. An older man who lived on the second floor and made the climb carefully. One hand on the wall where the plaster had been worn to a slight smoothness by exactly this habit. His hand and the hands of all the others who had steadied themselves in exactly this way on exactly this step. Each landing opened onto a short corridor, and from the corridor doors led to the individual apartments. The celli, which were small by almost any measure we might apply today. A single room often, or perhaps two if the tenant was prosperous enough to afford more. The walls inside were plastered and in many cases painted. Not elaborately, not in the way that wealthy houses were painted with their grand mythological scenes and their carefully rendered gardens, but with bands of color. A deep red at the base, a lighter ochre above, sometimes a simple decorative border that someone had applied with care and a steady hand. These small gestures of color made the rooms feel inhabited. Felt in the way a blanket draped over a chair makes a room feel lived in rather than merely occupied. The windows were an important thing to understand about these rooms. Glass was expensive and not commonly used in ordinary apartment windows, so the openings were covered instead with wooden shutters, or sometimes with thin sheets of translucent stone. Selenite which let in a soft diffused light without letting in the wind. When the shutters were open, the sounds of the street came in freely, the whole living texture of the city arriving without invitation. When they were closed, the room became its own contained world, and the sounds outside became something more distant and abstract. The way rain sounds when you are inside and warm, and the rain is only a sound and not a thing you are standing in. On the upper floors, the apartments were generally smaller and the rents were lower, which meant that the people who lived highest up were often those with the least, and also those who had the most stairs to climb at the end of a long day. There was a certain irony in this that the Romans themselves would have recognized. The wealthy living close to the ground and the poor living nearest the sky. Though the sky at least was free, and the view from a fifth-floor window over the rooftops of Rome, with the hills in the distance and the river catching the last of the light, was a view that no amount of money could improve. The staircase at this evening hour had a particular quality of sound. Footsteps, yes, and the occasional murmur of voices, but also the sounds coming through the walls and doors from the apartments themselves. The sounds of people settling in for the night. The clink of a ceramic pot being set down. The low voice of someone speaking to a child. The scrape of a stool being pulled across a stone floor. Somewhere above, the smell of something being heated over a small brazier. Oil and onion and something harder to name. The smell of a meal being made in a small space with simple things. A smell that is ancient and also entirely recognizable. The smell of someone feeding themselves and perhaps someone they love at the end of a day. The braziers were a central fact of apartment life. There were no hearths built into the walls of most insulae. No fixed fireplaces with their chimneys drawing smoke up and away. Instead, residents cooked and heated their rooms with portable braziers. Small metal or ceramic vessels that held burning charcoal. And these were carried from room to room as needed or simply left in the center of the space where their heat could reach the most of the room at once. The charcoal, when it was burning well, gave off a warmth that was dry and even, and the smell of it was something between mineral and woody. A clean sort of smell, and the glow of it in a dark room was a deep orange red that shifted and pulsed very slightly as the air moved around it. By the time full dark had come, the upper floors of the insula were mostly quiet. The children were in, the doors were closed. The shutters had been pulled to against the night air. The lamps were lit, small ceramic oil lamps with a wick floating in olive oil. And their light was warm and low and cast soft shadows that moved gently when anyone moved through the room. These lamps did not flood a space with light the way we are accustomed to now. They illuminated a radius, a small circle of warm visibility. And beyond that circle, the room held its shadows peacefully. A person reading by such a lamp would hold the lamp close to the text, or lean toward it, and the rest of the room would exist in a comfortable dimness that was not quite darkness. The olive oil in the lamp burned with a faint smell, something between grass and fruit and smoke. And this smell, the smell of a lit lamp in a small room, was as much a part of the evening as any sound. It was the smell of the hour before sleep, the smell of the last tasks being completed, a garment mended, a meal finished, a child settled, the small accountings that close a day. If you could carry that smell forward through time, it would still be recognizable as the smell of winding down, of the world narrowing to the size of a room, and then to the size of a bed, and then to the size of the space behind closed eyes. The beds in these apartments were simple things, most of them a wooden frame, sometimes raised on short legs, sometimes very low to the ground. a mattress filled with wool or straw. And straw was the more common of the two in ordinary households. The kind of mattress that carried the smell of its filling. Dry and faintly sweet, the smell of a field at the end of summer compressed into something you could sleep on. A blanket or several blankets layered. Because the nights in Rome could be cool, even in seasons that were warm by day. The stone of the building holding the cold of the previous night and releasing it slowly through the dark hours. A pillow of some kind, stuffed with wool or feathers if the household was comfortable enough, or simply a folded piece of cloth if it was not. The sleeping arrangements in a small apartment were rarely solitary. A husband and wife would share a bed, and children would sleep nearby, on smaller beds or on pallets on the floor, or sometimes simply in the same bed with the adults if the room was cold and the family was close. A slave, if the household had one, might sleep in the same room or just outside the door. This closeness was not experienced as a hardship in the way we might imagine it now. It was simply the texture of ordinary life, the warmth of other bodies nearby, the sound of other people breathing in the dark, which is one of the oldest and most reassuring sounds that human beings know. From the street below, if you were standing there and looking up, you would see the windows of the insula as small rectangles of warm light, some of them and others already dark, the shutters closed and the lamp extinguished, the household within already given over to sleep. The building as a whole was a kind of map of the evening's progress. The lower floors where the wealthier tenants lived showing light a little later. The upper floors where the day's labor had been heaviest going dark a little sooner. Not always, not by any rule, but as a general tendency, the way things tend without being required to. The city outside was not yet fully quiet. It would not be fully quiet for some hours yet. The streets of Rome were alive at night in their own way. The carts that were not permitted to enter the city during the day now beginning to make their way through, carrying grain and building stone and amphorae of wine and oil. Their wooden wheels on the stone streets making a sound that was low and constant and somehow more felt than heard when you were inside and nearly asleep. A vibration in the walls and the floor that was almost like the breathing of the city itself. But up here on the third floor or the fourth, with the shutters drawn and the lamp burning low and the last of the evening meal, a warmth still present in the chest. The city's nighttime activity was a distant thing, a murmur below the level of attention, something the sleeping mind could incorporate without being disturbed by it. The way sleepers near the sea incorporate the sound of waves. The way those who live near a river come to find the sound of water a part of silence rather than an interruption of it. The lamp burning on its small shelf or on the edge of a table would not be left to burn through the night in most households. Oil was not cheap enough to waste on darkness that no one was reading in. Someone would lean across and pinch the wick, or simply let it gutter out as the oil ran low. And then the room would be dark in the particular way that rooms are dark when the last light has gone. A darkness that is at first total and then gradually resolves itself as the eyes adjust. The faint glow from the street below finding its way through the edges of the shutters. The darkness becoming a softer thing. A gray dark, a darkness with texture. And in that texture dark, in the small warm space of the apartment, with the blanket pulled up and the sounds of the city moving below like a slow current, the people of the insula settled into their rest. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. Simply by degrees, the way the evening itself had come. The thoughts of the day growing less distinct. The sounds outside growing more abstract. The small concerns and small satisfactions of an ordinary life releasing their hold. One by one, as gently as hands opening. The building breathed around them, its plaster walls still holding a little of the day's warmth. Its staircase now empty and quiet, the worn stone steps resting in the dark. Floor by floor, room by room. The lamps went out, and the insula settled into the long middle portion of the night. Patient and still, holding its sleeping inhabitants the way the city held all its sleeping things. Carefully, without fuss, in the soft and ordinary dark. And so the night settled in. Layer by layer, the way warmth settles into a woolen blanket left near the hearth. Slowly, thoroughly, until every thread of it is touched. The upper floors of the insula were quiet now in their particular way, which was never quite silent, never quite still, but humming with the low and comfortable sounds of people who had come home and were no longer performing the day. Somewhere a door eased shut. Somewhere a child's voice asked a soft question and received a soft answer. The building breathed. It is worth pausing here. In this particular hour, the hour just after the public baths have released their last warm crowds into the cooling streets. The hour when the smell of olive oil and wood smoke begins to drift from a dozen small windows at once. Rising slowly up through the evening air the way smoke always rises. Unhurried, thinning as it goes. Carrying with it the first suggestion of the evening meal. This is the hour of supper on the upper floors. And it is an hour worth knowing, because it tells you something true and gentle about the way ordinary Romans lived their ordinary evenings. The way they fed themselves and rested themselves and prepared their bodies and their minds for the long, dark, comfortable hours ahead. The insulae, those great stacked apartment buildings that filled the neighborhoods of Rome in the 1st century, were home to most of the city's people. Not the grand houses with their cool courtyards and their mosaic floors and their fountains catching afternoon light. Those belonged to a much smaller world. The insulae were where the weavers lived, and the bread sellers and the men who carried things from one part of the city to another, and the women who kept small shops on the ground floor and slept above their own merchandise, and the families who had come from other places and found a room, sometimes just the one room, and made it into everything they needed a home to be. The upper floors were the most affordable and therefore the most populated. And by the time the evening had settled in and the streets below had begun their slow transition from the noise of commerce to the quieter noise of people simply moving through the world on their way to somewhere restful, those upper rooms were full of the soft industry of supper. Imagine, if you like, the smell of it. Garlic warming in a small clay pot set over a brazier. The oil just beginning to shimmer and whisper, releasing that round, sweet, slightly sharp smell that garlic gives when it is treated gently with heat. Alongside it, perhaps some dried lentils that have been soaking since midday, now soft enough to cook through quickly. Their earthy, faintly dusty smell mixing with the oil and the garlic into something that is simply the smell of someone being taken care of. Bread too, if there was bread left from the morning, set near the warmth to soften. Or flatbread made fresh, the dough patted thin and cooked directly on the surface of the brazier until it blistered and darkened in small spots and gave off that particular smell of grain and char that is one of the oldest smells in human life. The brazier itself was the center of the upper floor room in the evenings. It was a small thing, typically a portable ceramic or metal vessel that held coals or charcoal, and it served for both warmth and cooking. A practical, compact little sun that the family gathered around. In a room that might hold 6 or 7 people and all their possessions. The brazier was the anchor, the place toward which everything else oriented itself. The sleeping pallets would be rolled out later, but for now they were pushed to the walls, and the space around the brazier was the living space. The eating space, the talking space, the space where the evening happened. The light in these rooms was soft and a little smoky. Oil lamps, small terracotta ones that fit in the palm of a hand, gave off a warm and slightly amber glow that did not reach the corners of the room, but made the center of it feel enclosed and intimate. The way candlelight makes a table feel like its own small world. The flame of an oil lamp is a modest thing. It does not demand attention the way a fire does. It simply offers its small circle of visibility and lets the rest of the room remain in a comfortable, undemanding shadow. Several lamps together, set on a shelf or hung from a hook or balanced on the edge of a table, could make a room feel genuinely warm with light. And Romans who could afford it kept their evenings well lit in this gentle way. The lamps burning olive oil, which itself gave off a faint smell, clean and slightly grassy, adding one more quiet layer to the atmosphere of the room. Supper in the upper floors was not a complicated affair, and that simplicity was part of its comfort. The great elaborate dinners of Roman life, the ones that have come down through history in accounts of many courses and reclining guests and entertainment between dishes, those belonged to a different world. The world of the wealthy. The world of houses with dining rooms specifically designed for display and hospitality. Up here, supper was what it needed to be. Nourishing, warm, shared pulses were a staple. Lentils and chickpeas and fava beans, cooked soft with oil and herbs, sometimes with a little garum stirred in at the end. That fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way later centuries would use salt, as a deepener of flavor, a thing that made other flavors more fully themselves. The smell of garum was strong, pungent and saline and complex, and if you were not accustomed to it, you might find it overwhelming. But in a Roman kitchen, it was simply the smell of food being finished. The final flourish before the pot was brought to the table. There would have been olives, very likely dark ones or green ones, kept in a small jar in oil, their skin slightly wrinkled and slick, their flesh giving that particular combination of salt and bitterness and richness that makes an olive feel like a complete thing in the mouth. Cheese sometimes firm and white and salty, the kind made from sheep's milk that kept well and traveled well and could be eaten without preparation, simply cut and placed on the bread. Dried figs if the season had been good and the family had put some by, sweet and dense and slightly grainy, their seeds giving the faintest crunch. These were the foods of ordinary Roman evenings. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required much in the way of equipment or skill or time, and yet assembled together on a wooden board or in a shallow clay dish. They made a meal that was genuinely satisfying, that filled the body and calmed it, that prepared a person for sleep in the way that good, simple food always does. The family ate together generally, gathered close around the brazier, sitting on low stools or on the edge of the sleeping pallets or simply on the floor, which in the upper rooms was often bare wood, smooth with use and slightly warm from the building's accumulated heat. Children ate alongside adults without ceremony, the smallest ones perhaps held in a lap, the older ones reaching for their own portions with the confident ease of people who knew their place at the table, which was simply wherever there was room. Conversation during supper would have been the conversation of people who had been apart all day and were now together again. Not grand conversation, not debate or philosophy, but the soft exchange of small information. What had happened, who had been seen, what the price of bread was at the stall on the corner, whether the neighbor's baby was better or still unwell. The kind of talking that is really a form of touching, a way of confirming that everyone is still here, still accounted for, still part of the same small world. The sounds of supper carried through the building in a way that was not intrusive but was companionable. The scrape of a clay pot being moved, the low murmur of voices from the room next door, indistinct but warm in tone. Somewhere a few floors down, someone was playing a simple instrument, a flute perhaps, or something like one, a soft and repetitive melody that drifted up through the building without insisting on itself. Simply present the way birdsong is present, adding to the texture of the evening without demanding response. The building was full of people all doing more or less the same thing at more or less the same time. And there was a kind of deep comfort in that synchrony, in being one warm room among many warm rooms, one small lamp among many small lamps, all of them burning together in the great dark bulk of the insula while the city moved slowly through its evening outside. Outside, the streets were not yet fully quiet. The first-century city did not go to sleep all at once. It wound down gradually, and the evening hours were still populated with people making their way home from the baths, or stopping at a thermopolium, one of the small food counters built into the street-level walls of buildings throughout the city, where hot food was kept in ceramic vessels set into the stone counter, and you could stop and eat standing up, or take something away wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The thermopolia served the people who had no brazier, or no time or no one to cook for them, and they were busy in the early evening, the smell of their warming food drifting out into the street and mixing with the smell of the city itself, which was stone and dust and the particular organic warmth of a place where many thousands of people and animals lived in close proximity. Not unpleasant exactly, simply present. The smell of a city being alive. But up in the upper floors, the street was already becoming something heard rather than participated in. A background sound, the occasional cartwheel on stone, the distant call of a voice, the soft and irregular percussion of footsteps that were going somewhere else. The room had turned inward. The supper was nearly finished. The last of the bread used to wipe the bowl clean in the way that Romans did. Practically without waste, the bread soaking up the last of the oil and the garum and the lentil broth until the bowl was as clean as if it had been washed, which was itself a kind of preparation for washing it, a preliminary step in the evening's small orderly rituals. Afterward, there was the business of tidying, which in a small room was quickly done. The clay pot stacked, the wooden board wiped with a damp cloth, the lamp oil checked, topped up if needed from the small ceramic flask kept on the shelf, the brazier's coals encouraged to burn down slowly rather than extinguished outright. because the room needed its warmth through the night, especially in the upper floors where there was no borrowed heat from the ground and where the air could turn cool even in the milder months, carrying through the window the faint night smell of the city. Stone cooling, dew beginning, the green and slightly mineral smell that Roman nights had in the hours after sunset. A smell that was different from the day's smell in a way that was hard to name, but immediately recognizable. The smell of the world resting. The children were growing quieter. The smallest ones were already fading. The way small children fade in the evening. Not fighting it, but simply going. Their eyes softening, their bodies becoming heavier in the arms that held them. Their breath slowing into the deep and uncomplicated rhythm of childhood sleep. There is something in watching a child fall asleep that is itself quieting. That invites the adults nearby to let their own vigilance soften a little. To feel the day's work as something genuinely finished. As something that can now be set down. The room was dimming as the lamps were turned low, one by one until only one remained burning. A single small flame that was enough to see by if you needed to move through the room, but not enough to keep anyone awake. Just a gentle presence against the dark. A reminder that the night was not total. That warmth and light were still there. Simply resting. The sleeping pallets were unrolled now, brought out from their places against the walls and laid on the floor of the room. Close together in the way that small spaces require and that cold nights encourage. The bodies of the family arranged like the spokes of a wheel around the low warmth of the dying brazier. The pallets were stuffed with straw or wool or rushes, and they gave off a dry, faintly sweet smell when they were unrolled. The smell of material that had absorbed the warmth and the breath of many nights. A smell that was entirely domestic, entirely familiar, entirely the smell of this particular family's sleep. Blankets were pulled over, rough wool ones that were heavy and warm, and the small adjustments of settling in began. The shifting and the sighing and the pulling of covers. The brief murmured exchanges that were the last words of the day. And slowly, in the way that evenings in small rooms always slowly arrive at their conclusion. The room grew still, the voices stopped. The shifting stopped, the single lamp burned on for a little while, its flame barely moving in the still air, casting its amber circle on the ceiling, on the walls, on the sleeping shapes beneath their blankets. Outside, the street sounds had thinned to almost nothing. The city's evening commerce concluded. The thermopolia shuttered, the last of the bathers long since home. The night had arrived in full now, soft and dark and comprehensive, settling over the upper floors of the insula the way a blanket settles, gradually conforming itself to every shape beneath it, finding every corner, leaving nothing uncovered. The lamp would burn itself out in its own time, quietly without drama, the flame growing smaller and smaller until it was the smallest possible version of itself, and then simply not there. And the room would be dark, and the family would be asleep, and the building would hold them, all of them on all their floors, in the patient and unremarkable way that buildings hold the people who live inside them. Simply present, simply solid, a container for all that warmth and breath and quiet dreaming, waiting without impatience for the morning, which was still a long and restful way away. And so the night settled more deeply into itself, the way a blanket settles when you stop adjusting it and simply let it rest. Inside the insula, inside those tall and slightly leaning apartment buildings that rose 4 and 5 stories above the cobblestones of Rome. The darkness was not quite complete. It was never quite complete. There was always somewhere the small warm eye of an oil lamp still burning, casting its amber circle on a plastered wall, trembling very gently whenever someone turned in their sleep or a draft found its way through a gap in the wooden shutters. The Romans burned oil in their lamps. Olive oil most commonly, the same oil that dressed their bread and softened their skin. And a few had been there, standing quietly in one of those narrow corridors. You might have caught the faintest thread of it in the air. Something between a kitchen and a garden. Warm and slightly green, the smell of a pressed olive carried into the night. The lamps themselves were small enough to hold in one hand. Potters shaped them from reddish clay, smoothing the surface with a thumb, leaving a hole at the top for filling and a spout at one end where the wick would sit. Some were plain and unadorned, made quickly and cheaply for ordinary households. Others had little decorations pressed into the clay. A leaf, a bird, the face of a god worn soft by handling. A family might own several of these lamps, though burning oil through the night was a small expense that not everyone could easily afford. And so many households let the last lamp gutter out sometime in the middle hours. And after that there was only the darkness and whatever faint light the moon sent in through the shutters, lying in pale strips across the floor. The floors in most of these apartments were simple things. Packed earth on the lower levels, or tiles of terracotta laid in plain patterns, or sometimes just wooden planks that shifted and whispered underfoot. There was no softness to them. A family sleeping in one of the middle floors of an insula would have known exactly what the floor felt like, because many of them slept on it, or very close to it, on low pallets or folded mats or whatever arrangement of cloth and cushion they had managed to put together. The wooden bed frames that wealthier Romans slept on, carved and decorated, strung with leather straps or rope to hold the mattress. Those were furnishings of some cost. In the crowded upper apartments where the rents were lowest, people made do with simpler arrangements, and they slept close together for warmth as much as for affection. The children tucked in among the adults, everyone breathing the same slow air. And the walls between them were thin. That is perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about sleeping in an ancient Roman apartment block. The thing that takes a moment to settle into the imagination properly. These were not the solid stone walls of a country villa or a wealthy townhouse. The upper floors of an insula were often built more lightly, with timber framing and panels of wattle and plaster, materials that kept the weight manageable but let sound pass through with very little effort. A neighbor turning over, murmuring something half-formed in a dream. The soft percussion of a child's restless feet against a wall. These things traveled, they were part of the texture of the night. Not interruptions to it exactly, but a kind of shared presence. A reminder that you were sleeping not alone, but among many. Imagine, if you like, the feeling of lying in one of those upper rooms. The city still faintly audible below. Your own breath slowing, and through the wall to your left, the sound of someone else's steady sleeping. A rhythm as reliable as a tide. There is something unexpectedly comforting in that. A sense of being held within a larger thing. A building full of breathing. A neighborhood full of buildings. All of it continuing quietly through the dark hours. The insulae of Rome were home to enormous numbers of people. The city in the 1st century held perhaps 1 million souls, and the great majority of them lived not in the spacious houses with their interior gardens and their mosaic floors, but in these stacked and teeming apartment blocks. Sometimes 6 or 7 families to a floor. Sometimes more. The ground floors were often given over to shops and workshops. A bakery, a fuller's establishment, a place where someone sold wine by the cup. And these spaces closed up for the night, their wooden shutters folded across the front, though the smells of the day lingered pleasantly. Bread that had been baked since before sunrise, the faint mineral tang of the fuller's trade, the sweetness of wine soaked into old wood. Above the shops, the apartments climbed. The lower floors were more desirable, easier to reach, less vulnerable to the heat that gathered at the top of the building in summer, and closer to the ground in the way that people have always found reassuring. The rents on the lower floors reflected this, and so the families with a little more ease in their circumstances settled there, in rooms that were still modest by almost any standard, but had perhaps a window that looked onto a small courtyard, or a ceiling high enough to stand beneath without stooping. Higher up, the rooms grew smaller and the ceilings lower and the walls thinner still. And here the poorest residents of the building made their homes, sleeping in spaces that were essentially just enough room for a body and its few possessions, with the sounds of the city rising up from below and the sounds of neighbors coming through from every side. And yet sleep came. It came to the tired body the way it always does, without asking permission, without requiring the right conditions. A laborer who had spent the day carrying loads at the docks or mixing mortar at a construction site did not lie awake contemplating the thinness of the walls. He lay down and the darkness took him, and the lamp, if there was one, burned on for a while beside him. And then perhaps someone else in the room reached over and pinched the wick, and the small flame bent and disappeared, and the room became the same as all the other rooms around it, just breathing in warmth and the particular silence that is not really silence at all. The oil lamp, before it went out, would have done its quiet work of making the room feel inhabited, feel safe. Romans were not indifferent to the dark. No people who lived before electric light were entirely indifferent to the dark. And the lamp was a kind of companion, a small steady thing that asked nothing and gave its light without drama. Some households kept a lamp burning through the night near a little household shrine, a lararium where the family's protecting spirits were honored with a figure or a painting. Sometimes just a simple niche in the wall with a few offerings left in it. A bit of food, some incense. A flower when flowers were available. The lamp near the lararium was not for reading or working. It was simply there, a gesture of continuity, a way of keeping something lit against the dark hours. And its glow would have been the last thing a child saw before sleep and the first thing visible in the gray beginning of morning. The smell of the lamp oil mixed with other smells as the night deepened. Wood smoke, if a small brazier had been used for warmth and cooking earlier in the evening. Though open fires inside the upper apartments were a source of great anxiety, and the cautious household would have let the coals die down to nothing before sleeping. Wool, which was the dominant fabric of Roman life, worn and slept in and stored in chests, giving the air a warm animal softness. Food smells that had not entirely left. Garlic, olive oil again, the faint sharpness of garum. the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way later peoples would use salt, on nearly everything in nearly every dish. These were not unpleasant smells to the people who lived among them. They were simply the smell of home, of an ordinary evening, of a room that had been lived in all day and was now resting. The wooden shutters on the windows were important objects in this nightly settling. During the day, they could be folded back to let in light and air, and the window would be open to the street sounds and the smells of the city, the calls of vendors and the rumble of cart wheels and the conversations of passers-by. But in the evening, the shutters were drawn across, and the room became its own small world. Slightly muffled, slightly warmer, the street sounds reduced to a murmur that passed through the wood without quite entering. Roman windows did not generally have glass. Glass was expensive and not widely used in ordinary buildings. And so the shutters were the only real barrier between the sleeping family and the night air, which in Rome could be mild and soft in the summer months and considerably less gentle in the depths of winter. Gaps in the shutters let in threads of cold air, and people slept with more layers in winter, pulling cloaks over themselves as additional blankets, wearing their tunics to bed, keeping close. There is something tender about all of this, about the smallness of the arrangements, the ingenuity of making comfort from simple things. A folded cloak becomes a pillow. A clay lamp becomes a night light. A thin wall becomes, in its own way, a kind of company. The people sleeping in those upper rooms of the insula had very little by way of material comfort compared to what we might expect from a night's sleep. And yet the body's need for rest is not particular about its surroundings. Not really, and so they slept. And the night held them as it holds everyone, without distinction. Somewhere below, the city was not entirely still. Rome had rules about wheeled traffic. Carts and wagons were largely prohibited from moving through the city streets during the daylight hours, to ease the terrible congestion of a city that large. And so the hours of darkness were when the supply carts came in, when the wagons carrying stone and timber and grain and amphorae of wine and oil made their slow way through the narrow streets. This was a sound the Romans who lived in the lower floors knew well. The deep rumble of wooden wheels on stone, the patient plodding of oxen, the occasional voice of a driver calling out softly in the dark. It was not a sharp or startling sound. It was a low, continuous thing, a kind of bass note beneath the silence. And for those who had grown up hearing it, it was simply part of what night sounded like in Rome, as unremarkable as the sound of wind or rain. The people sleeping in the upper stories were somewhat removed from this rumble, their rooms higher above the street, the sound arriving to them already softened by distance and the mass of the building. What reached them was more like a feeling than a sound, a faint vibration in the floor, the building acknowledging the city's nighttime business and then settling back into stillness. And the sleepers, deep in their rest, would not have registered it consciously at all. It was simply part of the texture of the night, woven in among the breathing and the thin wall sounds and the occasional murmur of a dreaming child. The lamp near the lararium burned on, smaller now as the oil diminished, its flame a little lower, a little steadier in the stillness of the deep night hours. The wick had been trimmed earlier in the evening. You had to trim the wick regularly or it would smoke and char, and the flame would grow unruly. And now it burned cleanly, a small bright point in the darkness, casting its circle of amber light on the painted wall behind the niche, where the household spirits stood in their simple poses, patient and mild, watching over the sleeping room with whatever benevolent attention such figures were imagined to possess. The plaster on the walls of these rooms was sometimes painted, even in the more modest apartments. Not the elaborate mythological scenes of wealthy houses, but simple bands of color. Red at the bottom, a creamy white above. Perhaps a stripe of ochre or green to divide them. In the lamplight, these colors were warm and close. The red deepened to something almost brown. The white turned golden. The room in lamplight was a different room than the room in daylight. Smaller and warmer and more complete in itself. A room that had gathered itself inward for the night. And now the lamp was very low. The oil was nearly gone. The flame moved in a slow, unhurried way, as if it too were growing drowsy, as if even the light were finding its way toward rest. In a little while it would go out on its own, quietly without any fuss, and the room would be entirely dark except for whatever the moon was doing outside the shutters. And the building would be just a shape in the night, a container of sleeping people, all of them breathing their slow and separate rhythms, all of them somewhere in the long country of their dreams. The walls between them were thin, and the sounds passed through. And this was simply how it was, how it had always been in this city, in this building, in this particular way of being human together in the dark. The lamp gave one more small flutter, the flame bending as if nodding, and then it settled again, burning on just a little longer, keeping its quiet company with the sleeping room and everyone in it. While outside, the first of the supply carts made its slow way down the hill, its wheels turning steadily on the old stone, carrying its ordinary cargo through the ordinary dark toward the morning that was, in its own unhurried way, beginning to consider arriving. And so the city breathed on, in that particular way that cities breathe when most of their inhabitants have finally surrendered to sleep. When the last lamps have guttered down to their copper dishes and the last voices have softened into silence behind closed shutters. The streets of Rome, those narrow stone corridors that during the day rang with the voices of fishmongers and the clatter of sandals and the endless negotiations of ordinary commerce, had settled into something quieter now. Something that was not quite silence, but was the closest thing to it that a city of perhaps 1,000,000 souls could reasonably manage. And it was into this qualified quiet that the carts began to arrive. They came as they always came, from the edges of the city first, rolling in through the great gates that had been closed to wheeled traffic since the morning hours. Because Rome had long ago decided that the practical business of supply and removal was best conducted in darkness, when the living streets could not be tangled and choked by the necessary but unglamorous work of keeping a city fed and clean and provisioned. The law was simple and old, and everyone understood it. Wheeled vehicles, with certain careful exceptions, were not permitted within the city during daylight hours. And so the night belonged to the carts. Imagine, if you will, the sound of them at a distance. The way a sleeper in one of those upper rooms of an insula might first register the noise not as a sound at all, but as a faint trembling in the walls. A barely perceptible vibration traveling up through the stone and timber and plaster of the building itself. The city's skeleton conducting the message upward from the street below. The iron-rimmed wheels on the stone paving. That particular sound, low and continuous, and somehow both mechanical and organic at once, like a very slow and very heavy kind of rain. It would work its way into a light sleeper's dreams before it ever became a conscious sound, woven into whatever landscape the sleeping mind had constructed for itself that night. The carts carried everything. That is perhaps the simplest and most remarkable thing about them. The sheer variety of what moved through Rome in the hours between darkness and dawn. There were the grain carts, heavy and deliberate, coming in from the warehouses near the river. The great Tiberside Horia, where the grain dole was stored in its vast and orderly quantities, enough to feed the cities poor through another day. The grain itself would have smelled of dry straw and dust and something faintly sweet. The way all stored grain smells. A smell that carries with it the memory of open fields and summer heat, even when it is moving through a narrow urban street in the small hours of the night. There were the carts carrying amphorae of olive oil and wine. Those tall ceramic vessels packed in straw and sawdust to cushion them against the jolting of the road, each one sealed with its plug of clay or cork, each one representing the labor of some distant farm or press. The men who drove these carts knew their routes the way a river knows its channel. Through long repetition, through the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of identical nights. They did not need to think about where to turn. Their mules knew the way as well as they did. Those patient animals whose hooves made their own particular sound on the stone. A softer, more organic rhythm beneath the grinding of the wheels. The mules were perhaps the most important creatures in Rome after dark. They were not beautiful animals, not the kind of creature that appeared in paintings or was celebrated in poetry. But they were steady and strong and remarkably tolerant of night work, of the smells and sounds of a city that was strange even in daylight and stranger still in darkness. A good mule for night cart work was a valuable thing, and the men who drove the carts knew their animals with an intimacy born of long shared labor. Knew which ones were calm in the narrow streets near the Forum, and which ones grew uneasy near the tanneries, where the smell of the curing leather drifted out into the air even at this hour. A sharp and unmistakable presence that the mules registered with a slight shifting of their weight, a small adjustment of their ears. The drivers themselves were a particular kind of person, shaped by the particular demands of their work, in the way that all people are shaped by what they do in the hours that constitute most of their waking lives. They were night people in a city that was mostly a day city. And this gave them a relationship to Rome that was different from the relationship of the bakers, or the shopkeepers, or the senators, or the water carriers. They knew the city in its stripped-down state, without its crowds and its noise and its performance of itself. They knew which streets had uneven paving that could catch a wheel, and which fountains were still running strong at the third hour of the night, and where a cart could be pulled aside for a moment while the driver rested his eyes and let the mule stand still in the comfortable darkness. Some of them would have known each other, would have developed the easy familiarity of people who share a particular world that most others never see. Two drivers passing in opposite directions in a narrow street. One heading toward the Forum with a load of building stone. One heading back toward the river with empty amphorae rattling softly in their straw. Might exchange a few words in the darkness. A brief conversation conducted without either man fully stopping. Just a slowing and a passing, and a few syllables of information or greeting before each continued on his way. The sound of their voices would drift upward through the still air and might reach a window where someone lay awake. not with anxiety, but simply with that particular wakefulness that sometimes visits in the middle of the night. That state of comfortable alertness that is not quite sleep and not quite waking, but something pleasant in between. For those who were awake and listening, the carts offered a kind of company. There is something reassuring about the sound of work continuing in the darkness, about the knowledge that the city's practical life is being attended to, that the necessary things are being moved from where they are to where they are needed. The person lying on their simple mattress in the upper room of an insula, listening to the distant grind and clatter of iron wheels on stone, might feel a certain quiet comfort in it, the sense of being held within a larger system that was functioning as it should, that was taking care of itself in the night. The removal carts came too, of course, and these were part of the same nocturnal system, the same great practical metabolism of the city. Rome produced waste in quantities that required organized removal. And the night was when that removal happened, when the large ceramic vessels that served the apartment blocks were emptied and their contents taken away to the fullers' workshops where urine was a working substance, a tool of the trade, or carried out to the fields beyond the city walls where it would become, in time, part of the soil that grew the grain that would come back again in those heavy, deliberate carts from the riverside warehouses. Everything circulated, everything returned, the city was, in this sense, a kind of slow and enormous wheel, turning through its own necessities with a patience that individual Romans might not have recognized, but that was nonetheless the rhythm underlying all their days and nights. The fullers' workshops, those places where cloth was cleaned and processed, were among the businesses that made particular use of the night hours, and the smell of them was one of the characteristic smells of certain neighborhoods, a smell that residents became so accustomed to that they ceased to notice it, the way one ceases to notice the smell of one's own home. A visitor to Rome might register it with some surprise, but for the person who had grown up in those streets, it was simply part of the texture of the place. As unremarkable as the smell of the river, or the faint mineral scent of the aqueduct water, or the wood smoke that drifted from the bakeries where the ovens were already, at this hour, beginning their long warming toward the morning's work. The bakeries, this is worth pausing on for a moment. The way the night carts and the bakeries existed in a kind of relationship. The carts bringing the grain to the mills, and the mills sending the flour to the bakers, and the bakers beginning their work in the deep middle of the night, so that by the time the city woke there would be bread. Warm and ready, the smell of it spreading through the streets in the early morning, in that particular way that the smell of bread has of making everything seem, for a moment, entirely well. The bakers were awake now, in these hours when the carts were moving, tending their fires, working their dough, engaged in the ancient and repetitive and somehow deeply satisfying labor of turning flour and water and a little salt into something that could feed a person through the day. The sound of the mills, where they were still turning, was another layer in the night's acoustic texture. The large grain mills of Rome were often turned by donkeys, those patient circular journeys in the dark around the millstone, the grain feeding in from above and the flour emerging below in a slow and steady stream. And the sound of the millstone turning was a low grinding that was different from the grinding of cart wheels on stone. Softer somehow, more continuous, less interrupted. A sound that had a kind of meditative quality to it. The sound of transformation happening slowly and reliably in the dark. A person walking through Rome in these hours, which some people did, night watchmen and water inspectors, and the occasional insomniac taking the air, would have moved through a city that was simultaneously asleep and working, would have passed through alternating zones of quiet and activity. The sleeping apartment blocks and the busy street below. The dark temple precinct and the lit bakery doorway, where the warmth and the smell of the fire came out into the cool night air like an invitation. The night watchmen, the vigiles, moved through this landscape with the particular authority of people who have been given responsibility for a place. Their presence one of the quiet reassurances of the night. The knowledge that someone was attending, that someone was watching over the sleeping city with a professional and unhurried care. The vigiles were also, practically speaking, the people who watched for fire. And fire was the great concern of a city built largely of timber and plaster. A city where cooking fires and oil lamps were the only sources of heat and light, and where the buildings were close together and the streets narrow. But in these hours, with most fires banked and most lamps extinguished, the risk was lower and the vigiles could move through their patrol routes with a certain ease. Pausing to exchange a word with a cart driver, or to check that a fountain was still flowing, or simply to stand for a moment in a quiet street and look up at the sky, which in Rome, even then, was somewhat obscured by the smoke and haze of a great city, but which still offered, on a clear night, the faint wash of stars above the roof lines, the same stars that were visible from the countryside, from the farms and the vineyards and the small towns of the Italian peninsula. The same stars that had always been there, patient and unchanged, above whatever human arrangements happened to be taking place beneath them. The carts continued their work through all of this, indifferent to stars, indifferent to the sleeping and the waking, indifferent to the philosophical reflections of any insomniac vigiles who happened to be looking upward. They had their routes and their schedules and their particular cargoes, and they moved through the city with the purposeful patience of work that knows its own necessity, that does not need to be celebrated or noticed in order to continue. They were the night's most honest inhabitants, perhaps the most straightforwardly engaged with the simple reality of what the city required in order to be itself. And gradually, so gradually, that it was impossible to say exactly when it began, the quality of the darkness was starting to change. Not lighter yet, not in any way that could be pointed to or named, but different the way the air in a room changes when someone opens a door in a distant part of the house. A subtle shift in pressure, a hint of something new working its way through the existing atmosphere. The carts were still rolling. The mules were still patient. The drivers were still navigating their familiar routes through the familiar dark. But something in the city's long exhalation of night was beginning, very slowly, to turn toward its inhalation of morning. The last of the deep sleepers in their upper rooms were at their most deeply asleep now, in that profound and restful hour before the birds began, before the first pale suggestion of light found its way between the shutters, before the city began to remember itself and its purposes and its endless, energetic engagement with the business of being alive. They lay in their simple beds in their small rooms, breathing slowly, dreaming whatever they were dreaming, held in the warm and ordinary dark while below them the carts moved on, carrying their ordinary cargoes through streets that were, in their own quiet way, already beginning the long, slow work of becoming morning. The stone of the streets held the memory of the day's warmth still, a faint residual heat rising from the paving, and the air above it carried the mingled smells of the city at rest. Wood smoke and river water and the distant sweetness of grain and the clean cold coming down from the hills. all of it settling together into something that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply the smell of Rome in the last hour before dawn. The smell of a city that had been itself for a very long time, and intended to go on being itself for a very long time more. Patient and enormous and full of sleeping people, moving through its night toward its morning with the unhurried certainty of something that has done this many times before. And somewhere in that great sleeping city, moving quietly through its darkened streets, there were men whose whole purpose was simply to watch. They were called the vigiles, and if you had happened to be awake in those small hours, sitting perhaps by a window, or lying restless on your mat while the apartment breathed around you, you might have caught a glimpse of one of them passing below, the soft orange smear of his lantern sliding along the wall of the insula opposite. There for a moment and then gone, swallowed by the darkness between buildings. He would not have hurried. There was no reason to hurry. His job was the slow, patient work of attention, and he understood it the way a shepherd understands a hillside. Not as something to be conquered or rushed through, but as something to be known, intimately over time. The vigiles had existed in one form or another since the early years of the 1st century, when the Emperor Augustus looked at his city and understood that a place built so densely, with so many people living so close together in structures made largely of wood and plaster and dried reed, needed something more than luck to carry it through each night. He organized them into cohorts, 7 of them each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 regions. And he gave them a headquarters and a purpose and, perhaps most importantly, a reason to take pride in the unglamorous hours between dusk and dawn. They were freedmen, mostly men who had once been enslaved and had since been granted their freedom. And the vigiles offered them something that mattered enormously in a city as status-conscious as Rome. A role, a uniform of sorts, a place in the fabric of things. Imagine the smell of the night air as one of these men begins his round. It is the particular smell of a Roman residential street in the hours after the evening meal. Wood smoke still drifting from the braziers and the communal hearths. The faint warm ghost of bread that was baked that afternoon. Something oily and herbal from the food stalls that are now shuttered and dark. And underneath all of it, the cool mineral smell of stone that has been absorbing heat all day and is now slowly, quietly releasing it back into the air. The man breathes it in without thinking about it, the way you breathe in the smell of your own home. He has walked this route so many times that his feet know the uneven places in the pavement before his eyes do. Know where the stones are loose and where a channel cut for rainwater runs diagonally across the path and could catch an unwary ankle in the dark. The primary concern of the vigiles was fire, and this was not an abstract worry. The insulae of Rome, those tall, crowded apartment buildings that housed the great majority of the city's population, were structures in which fire could move with a speed and completeness that is difficult to fully imagine from the outside. The buildings were several stories high, sometimes 6 or 7, and the upper floors in particular were constructed with a great deal of timber framing, with walls of wattle and daub or thin brick that held heat and channeled air in ways that helped flames rather than hindered them. The families living in those upper rooms cooked on small portable braziers, heated their spaces with charcoal, kept oil lamps burning through the evening. Each of these was a small, manageable warmth in the hands of an attentive person, and a danger in the hands of someone who had fallen asleep over their supper, or who had left a lamp too close to a hanging cloth before going to bed. The Vigiles knew all of this. It was the texture of their professional understanding, the thing they thought about as they walked. A man on night watch develops a particular sensitivity to the visual quality of darkness. He learns to read it the way a sailor reads water, noticing the differences between one kind of dark and another. The ordinary darkness of a shuttered window is one thing. The darkness of a street where a lamp has simply burned down overnight is another. And there is a third kind, a darkness that has a faint warmth at its edges, a subtle wrongness, a smell that is not quite the comfortable smell of cooking fires or braziers, but something sharper and more urgent. That is the darkness a Vigiles learns to notice above all others. They carried with them the tools of their work, and these tools were humble and practical and speak to the unglamorous reality of what firefighting looked like in the ancient world. There were buckets made of leather stitched carefully at the seams to hold water without too much seeping through. There were long poles with hooks at the end, designed not to extinguish a fire directly, but to pull away burning material, to drag a flaming beam out through a window, to tear down a section of burning wall before the fire could use it as a bridge to the next building. There were hand pumps, siphons, bronze devices that could be filled with water and then operated by two men working a lever back and forth, sending a thin pressured stream against a burning surface. These were not small things to carry through the streets at night, and the Vigiles who worked the equipment had a physical solidity to them, a kind of unhurried strength that comes from the same repeated effort over many years. But the most important tool, in many ways, was simply the act of walking, of being present, of moving through the streets at a time when almost everyone else was still, and noticing what was there to be noticed. A Vigiles might complete his circuit of his assigned district several times in a single night, and each time around he was building a slightly more complete picture of how the night was unfolding, which windows still showed a faint thread of lamplight, which doorways smelled of recent cooking, where a dog had begun to bark for no obvious reason, and where the bark had subsided into silence again. The city at night was not a static thing, even when it was sleeping. It had a rhythm, a texture, a temperature that shifted as the hours passed, and a man who paid attention could feel those shifts the way you feel a change in the air before rain. There were stations, small outposts, essentially distributed through the city's regions, where the Vigiles could rest between rounds, where equipment was stored and where a man could sit for a while and let the warmth of a small fire work into his hands on a cold night. These places had a particular feeling, the feeling of spaces that exist to support work rather than to be comfortable in themselves. Functional, a little bare, smelling of damp leather and the mineral sharpness of the bronze equipment and the particular smell of men who spend their nights outdoors. There would have been a low murmur of conversation in these places, the quiet talk of people sharing an unusual kind of companionship, the companionship of those who are awake while the world sleeps. They would have talked about their rounds, about what they had seen, about the family on the third floor of the insula on the Via Sacra who always seemed to have their brazier going very late, about the old man who kept pigeons on the roof and whose birds sometimes made a soft, worried sound in the middle of the night for no reason anyone could explain. There was also the matter of water, and the Vigiles had a relationship with water that was almost as intimate as their relationship with fire. Rome was a city of extraordinary hydraulic engineering. The great aqueducts bringing water down from the hills into the city, feeding the fountains and the baths and the public troughs that were distributed through the neighborhoods. The Vigiles knew where every cistern was, knew which fountains ran reliably through the night and which were sometimes reduced to a trickle by the time the small hours came. They knew the weight of a full leather bucket and the weight of an empty one. And they knew how many buckets it took to bring a small fire down to something manageable, and how many it took when a fire had already found its way into the walls. For the people sleeping in the apartments above, the Vigiles were a kind of unconscious reassurance, a presence that most residents never thought about directly, but that existed as a background condition of life in the city. Like the sound of the fountains or the distant smell of the river. You went to sleep in your apartment, on your mat or your cot or your narrow bed. And somewhere below in the street, a man with a lantern was walking his circuit. And this was simply part of the arrangement, part of the contract between the city and its inhabitants, as unremarkable and as quietly essential as the walls themselves. The night deepened and the Vigiles walked on. In the residential districts, the insulae stood close together, their upper floors almost close enough to touch across the narrow streets. And in the darkness, they became shapes rather than buildings. Their details lost, their presence felt more than seen. Great masses of sleeping humanity stacked one above another in the dark, breathing in and out, dreaming whatever dreams came to people in the first century of the Common Era. Dreams that we cannot know and cannot recover, but that were surely as various and as strange and as ordinary as the dreams of any night in any city in any time. A man sleeping on the 4th floor of one of these buildings, his body accustomed to the particular firmness of his mat, the particular angle of the wall against which he has arranged himself, would have been aware of the city even in sleep. Aware of it the way you are aware of the weather, as a condition rather than a fact, something that surrounds you and shapes you without requiring your direct attention. The sounds of the night would have been part of his sleep. Woven into it, the distant creak of a cart somewhere far off, the occasional voice from the street below, the soft movement of the building itself as it settled and breathed in the cooling air. And somewhere in that weave of sound, perhaps the faint soft footfall of a Vigiles passing below, the brief warm smear of lantern light moving across the ceiling of his room. There for a moment and then gone. The Vigiles did not only watch for fire. They also kept a general eye on the peace of the streets. Not in the way of soldiers, not with the authority of the urban cohorts who handled more serious matters, but in the quieter way of men who are simply present and attentive, and whose presence itself has a calming effect on the small disorders that can accumulate in the dark hours of a city. A drunk man sitting in a doorway, not quite sure how he had come to be there. A dog that had gotten into a food stall and was making a considerable noise about it. Two people having an argument in the street that was more noise than danger. These were the textures of the night watch, the small human details that filled the hours between the major concerns. There was a particular quality to the light that a Vigiles carried. The lanterns of the ancient world. Small bronze or terracotta frames with thin panels of horn or oiled cloth to protect the flame, gave off a light that was warm and limited and close. A light that illuminated a small circle of the immediate world and left everything beyond it in a deeper darkness by contrast. Walking with such a lantern through the streets of Rome at night, you would have been aware of the extraordinary intimacy of that small pool of light. The way it made the texture of the stone pavement visible. The way it caught the surface of a wall and showed the roughness of the plaster. The way it turned the darkness just beyond its reach into something almost solid. The Vigiles in his small circle of warmth, moving through the enormous dark city. It is an image that has a kind of quietness to it. A self-containment, a sense of someone entirely at home in the particular conditions of his work. As the night moved toward its furthest point, the hours that feel most distant from both the evening just past and the morning still to come, the Vigiles continued their rounds with the same unhurried steadiness they had maintained since the beginning of their watch. The city around them was as quiet as it would ever be. The food stalls were dark. The baths were dark, the workshops and the counting houses and the temples were dark. Only the apartment buildings stood full of their invisible lives. Their sleeping occupants turned inward, their windows showing nothing. And in those windows, in those rooms, in the narrow beds and on the thin mats, and in the folded arrangements of cloaks that served as bedding for those who had little else, the people of Rome slept on, held in the ordinary miracle of sleep. That condition which is the same in every century and every city. That daily surrender to something larger than wakefulness. That small crossing over into a place where the concerns of the day grow soft and distant, and the body takes what it needs from the dark and the quiet and the warmth. The Vigiles walked, the city breathed. The lanterns moved their small warm circles through the streets, and the stone absorbed the night, and the fountains ran their soft continuous sound through all of it. And somewhere at the very edge of awareness, so faint it was barely a sound at all, the first of the delivery carts was beginning to make its way toward the city gates, its wheels turning slowly on the road outside the walls, bringing with it the first suggestion that the night, for all its depth and stillness, was a thing with edges, and that beyond those edges something was already, gently beginning to stir. And so the city breathed. Not in silence, Rome was never quite silent. Not even in those deepest hours when the oil in the lamps had burned down to a thin blue thread and the last of the wine cellars had finally pulled their shutters closed and gone to find whatever narrow corner of the world they called their bed. Even then, even in that profound middle darkness that settled over the Aventine and the Esquiline and the crowded slopes of the Subura, there was sound, there was always sound. It was simply a different kind of sound than the city wore in daylight. Softer in some places, stranger in others. Carrying farther in the cool air than anyone who had only ever walked those streets at noon might have expected. Think of the Tiber first, because the river never stopped. It moved through the night the way it moved through every night, wide and brown and unhurried, carrying its cargo of reflected starlight on the surface and its cargo of silt and memory underneath. The sound it made against the stone embankments and the wooden pilings of the docks was a low, continuous murmur, something between a whisper and a sigh. And in the insulae closest to the water, those tall, close-backed apartment buildings where families of 4 and 5, and sometimes more lived in rooms not much larger than the space a person needs to stretch their arms out fully. That sound came in through the gaps in the shutters and settled over sleeping bodies like a second blanket. People who had grown up near the river learned to sleep inside that sound the way a person learns to sleep inside the sound of their own breathing. It became part of the texture of rest itself. Further from the water, the sounds changed. In the narrow streets between the apartment blocks, the stones held the warmth of the day for a long time. You could press your hand to them well after sunset and feel something still radiating back. Faint and pleasant, like the warmth left in a seat someone has only just vacated. And as those stones slowly released their heat into the night air, the city made small sounds of settling and adjusting. Tiny creaks and murmurs that a light sleeper might notice, and a deep sleeper would fold into their dreams without ever knowing. The wooden upper floors of the insula, built out over the street on their brackets and beams, shifted and ticked in the cooling air. A shutter that had swollen in the afternoon heat contracted slightly and tapped once. Twice against its frame, a rope somewhere in a courtyard moved in a breath of wind and made a low, soft sound against whatever post it was tied to. These were the sounds that filled the spaces between the larger sounds. The sounds that you would only hear if you were lying awake in the dark and paying attention. Which some people were. There were always some people lying awake. A mother with a child who had been fussing since evening. Finally quieted now, the small warm weight of the child heavy and trusting against her side. A man who had eaten too late and too well and was waiting for the discomfort to ease. Staring up at the ceiling he could not quite see. An old woman who had lived long enough that sleep came to her in pieces now. A few hours here and a few hours there. And who spent the intervals between those pieces simply resting, listening to the building around her, finding a kind of companionship in all those layers of sound. Because the insulae were full of sound even at rest. 6 stories of families breathing and shifting and occasionally murmuring in their sleep. And all of that sound moved through the floors and walls and ceilings in ways that made the building feel, if you were quiet enough to notice, almost like a living thing. Footsteps from the floor above translated into a soft pressure, a barely there vibration in the plaster. A baby on the 3rd floor woke briefly and then was soothed back to sleep. And the sound of that, the small cry and then the low voice and then the quiet, traveled down through the building and dispersed into something too faint to quite identify. Just a sense that the building had stirred and settled again. The walls in these places were not thick. Privacy was a concept that existed more in the mind than in the architecture. But there was something almost comforting in that, in the knowledge that on the other side of the plaster someone else was also lying in the dark, also breathing, also part of this great collective act of rest that the city performed each night. Outside in the streets, the carts had come. This was the arrangement the city had made with itself. The practical, unglamorous logic of keeping a city of perhaps 1 million people fed and supplied without bringing it to a standstill during the day. In daylight, the streets of Rome were too full of people and feet, and the ordinary commerce of living to allow the heavy wagons through. And so the wagons came at night. They had been coming since sometime in the evening, rolling in from the roads that led south toward the grain ports, east toward the farms of the Campagna, north toward the market gardens that supplied the city with its vegetables and its cut flowers and its bundles of fresh herbs. The wheels were iron-rimmed and the streets were stone, and the sound they made together was a low, grinding rumble that traveled a long way through the night air and through the ground itself. Imagine lying on your mat on the floor of a room above one of those streets and feeling that rumble arrive before you hear it. A faint trembling in the floor, in the walls, in the air inside the room. and then the sound itself building slowly from somewhere far away, growing and growing until the cart was directly below and the whole room seemed to participate in the passing, and then fading again as the cart moved on, the sound diminishing back into the general murmur of the night. And then another cart and another. This was simply the rhythm of the night for anyone who lived near a major street. They had grown up with it. Their grandparents had grown up with it. It was as much a part of the night as the darkness itself. The drivers called out to each other sometimes, their voices carrying easily in the cool air. Not urgently, not loudly, just the ordinary back and forth of men doing a familiar job in the small hours. A word about the road ahead. A comment about the weight of a load. The kind of conversation that requires no particular answer and leaves no particular impression. Just the sound of human voices in the dark, which has its own kind of comfort. Mules and oxen added their own contributions. The slow, heavy sound of hooves on stone. The occasional snort or shift of weight. The creak of harness leather and the jingle of the fittings that held everything together. It was not a delicate soundscape, but it had a rhythm. And rhythm is something the sleeping mind can accommodate, can incorporate, can use as a kind of anchor while the rest of consciousness drifts away. There were other sounds that belonged specifically to the night. The watchmen who walked the streets carried their own small noises with them. The sound of sandals on stone, the occasional creak of their equipment, sometimes the low exchange of words with a colleague at a corner or a doorway. They were a presence in the night more than a disturbance, a sign that the city was tending to itself, that someone was paying attention so that everyone else could afford to stop paying attention for a while. In the bakeries, and there were bakeries scattered throughout every neighborhood, because bread was the foundation of everything, the thing that held the daily life of the city together. The ovens had been lit well before midnight, and the smell of baking bread moved through the streets in the small hours in a way that was entirely at odds with the darkness. Warm and yeasty and deeply, fundamentally reassuring, that smell found its way through gaps and shutters and into sleeping rooms. And whatever dreams were being dreamed in those rooms, they were probably not unhappy ones. The temples were quiet at this hour, but not entirely without presence. A priest or two might be moving through a precinct on some early obligation, their robes making a soft sound against the pavement. A lamp carried low, casting a small circle of amber light that moved with them and then was gone. The sacred fires that burned in certain shrines burned through the night. And the smell of that, of wood smoke and something sweeter underneath, some resinous offering or scented oil, drifted out into the streets and mixed with everything else, with the smell of the river and the bread and the animals and the stones, into that particular compound scent that was simply the smell of the city at night. Unrepeatable and unmistakable, the smell that anyone who had grown up in Rome would have recognized with their whole body as the smell of home. Dogs moved through the streets in the small hours. They were everywhere in the city. The dogs not quite wild and not quite owned, living in the spaces between, fed by whoever felt like feeding them, sleeping where they found warmth. At night they ranged more freely, and their sounds punctuated the darkness at intervals. A bark that started somewhere on the Calian and was answered, after a moment, by something across the valley. And then silence again. They were not alarming sounds. They were simply part of the texture of the night. The way birdsong was part of the texture of early morning, a sign that the world was continuing to be itself. And the birds were coming. Though not yet, there was still a long stretch of darkness before the birds. Still that deep middle portion of the night when the city was at its most thoroughly, most completely at rest. This was the hour when the streets between the carts were genuinely empty, when the sound of a single set of footsteps would carry a remarkable distance, when the stars overhead were as bright as they would be all night, and the smoke from the bakery fires rose straight up into the still air, and the Tiber made its low, continuous sound against the stones, and the city breathed and breathed and breathed. In the apartments, people lay in their various arrangements of sleep. On the lower floors, where the rooms were a little larger and the rents a little higher, a merchant and his household were arranged on their beds and their pallets with the particular unconscious organization of people who have slept in the same space for years. Each body in its accustomed place, each sleeper turned in their accustomed direction. On the upper floors, where the rooms were smaller and the ceilings lower and the heat of the day lingered longer, a family of freedmen slept in closer proximity. The children tucked against the wall, the adults nearest the door, everyone covered with whatever they had, which was enough higher still. In the attic spaces where the poorest tenants paid the least for the most inconvenient access and the greatest risk from the weather. A young man who had come to Rome from somewhere in the south to find work was sleeping on a straw-filled sack with his cloak pulled over him and his sandals placed carefully beside him. Ready for morning, and his sleep was the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has worked very hard with their body all day and has nothing left over for anything except rest. All of these people in all of these rooms, in all of these layers of the building, were doing the same thing. They were doing the thing that every human being in every city and every village and every farmhouse across the whole of the Roman world was doing at this same hour. They were letting go, they were releasing their hold on the day, on its demands and its small pleasures and its small frustrations, on the names of the people they owed money to and the names of the people who owed money to them, on the price of grain and the state of the roads and the question of what to do about the neighbor's dog and the 100 other threads that made up the fabric of a life in the city. They were setting all of that down and lying in the dark and breathing and going somewhere else for a while. The city held them while they did this. The stones and the plaster and the timber and the tile, all of it held them. The sounds of the night moved over and around and through the buildings, and the buildings absorbed what they could and let the rest pass. And the people inside went on sleeping, went on breathing, went on being. For these hours, simply bodies at rest in the dark, which is one of the oldest and most ordinary and most quietly remarkable things that a person can be. The carts were still rolling somewhere in the distance, their iron wheels making their low, grinding music on the stone. The Tiber was still moving. The bread was still baking. The dogs had settled somewhere warm and were sleeping too, their paws twitching occasionally with whatever dogs dream about, which is probably something simple and good. And the city, for all its size and noise and complexity, for all its million lives pressed close together in those tall, warm, creaking buildings, was resting now in the only way a city can rest. Not in silence, but in something gentler than silence. A breathing, a settling, a collective leaning toward the morning that was still some time away, still somewhere beyond the edge of the darkness. patient and unhurried, waiting for the moment that the night would quietly, almost imperceptibly, begin to soften into something else. And so it did soften, in the way that darkness always softens when it has finished its work. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in the smallest and most gradual of ways. The way a piece of wool left near a warm hearth slowly loses its stiffness and becomes something yielding and gentle again. The black above the rooftops of the insula began to thin at its edges, and the stars that had burned so steadily through the long hours of the night grew a little quieter in their brightness. Not gone, not yet, but somehow less insistent, as though they too were settling, drawing inward, preparing to rest after their long vigil over the sleeping city. And somewhere in that tender, uncertain interval before the change was anything you could truly name, the bakers of Rome were already awake. They had been awake, in fact. For some time, this was simply the nature of their lives, the rhythm they had been born into or apprenticed into as young men, the particular bargain they had made with the hours of the day. While the fuller and the bronze merchant and the scribe who worked for the magistrate were still folded into their blankets, still breathing the slow and even breath of deep sleep, the baker had already lit his lamp, already splashed cold water on his face from the clay basin beside his door, already wrapped his tunic close against the chill that pooled in the lower streets before dawn. Imagine, if you will, the smell of a Roman bakery in those earliest hours. It is one of the most particular smells in the world. Warm and yeasty and faintly sweet, with something underneath it that is almost smoky, almost mineral, coming from the great domed ovens built of volcanic stone and fired with wood that had been drying in a corner of the bakery for days. The smell of bread not yet baked, but on its way to being bread. The smell of dough that has been resting through the night under damp cloth, slowly rising, slowly becoming itself. It drifts out into the street before there is any light to see by. And if you were walking past in those quiet hours, that smell would reach you first, warm and reassuring, a small proof that the world was still in order. The bakeries of Rome, the pastrana, as they were called, were tucked throughout the city in the ground floors of buildings not so different from the ones where so many Romans slept. They were compact, practical spaces, built around the logic of their work. There would be the millstones, great heavy things of dark volcanic rock, shaped like hourglasses, set into stone bases worn smooth by years of use. During the day, these would be turned by donkeys, patient animals who walked their slow circles in the dim interior, grinding the grain into flour with a sound that was almost musical in its steadiness. A low rhythmic rumbling that the neighbors in the floors above had long since stopped hearing because it had become simply part of the sound of being alive in that place. But in the earliest hours of the morning, the donkeys were still resting, and the millstones were still, and the only sounds were the soft ones made by human hands at work. The baker and his workers, sometimes enslaved men, sometimes freedmen who had learned the trade and stayed with it, moved through the bakery with the ease of people who have done the same things in the same order so many times that the body knows what to do before the mind has fully arrived. Flour was scooped and measured, not with great precision, but with the practiced eye of long experience, the way a grandmother measures spices, knowing by feel and sight what is right. Water was added, and then the work of kneading began. The long rhythmic pressing and folding that transformed the rough mixture into something smooth and elastic. something that pushed back against the hands with a quiet resilience. Kneading bread is one of the oldest forms of physical work there is, and there is something deeply calming about it. Even to watch, even to imagine. The motion is repetitive and grounding. The resistance of the dough is constant and predictable. And the warmth that builds in the hands as the work continues is a gentle warmth. A warmth earned in the most ordinary and useful of ways. The workers in the pastrina would have moved through this work in near silence, or in the low murmur of men who have been together long enough that words are not always necessary. A quiet word here, a small gesture there. The particular ease of people who share a task they know well. The shaped loaves would be placed on wooden boards or flat stone surfaces to rest a little longer before going into the oven. And the oven itself would already have been heating for some time. The fire built up carefully with dry wood. The temperature judged by the baker's hand held near the opening, or by the color of the interior walls. A pale gold meaning not quite ready. A deeper warm gray meaning the moment was close. The Romans baked their bread in round loaves divided on top into sections, scored with a knife before baking so that the finished loaf could be broken apart easily, shared between hands without needing to be cut. These were practical, beautiful objects, and examples of them have survived, preserved by extraordinary circumstance in the ruins of Pompeii, still showing the marks of the baker's knife, still divided into their neat portions. A detail so specific and so human that it is almost startling to encounter. The city outside was still quiet, but not silent. The carts that had been permitted to move through Rome's streets only at night were beginning their final rounds. The wooden wheels on stone sending up that low, rolling rumble that had been the background sound of the Roman night for hours. The drivers of these carts, hauling building materials, carrying amphorae of wine and olive oil from the warehouses near the river, moving the endless supplies that kept a city of perhaps 1 million people fed and built and running. These men were finishing their work now, turning their animals toward the stables, their loads delivered or nearly so. Their voices, when they called to one another across the dark streets, were not the voices of men beginning their day, but of men at the end of a long night's work. A little tired, a little quieter than they might have been at the start of their shift, ready for their own rest. And as the carts began to thin, as the rumbling of wheels grew less frequent and the pauses between one cart and the next grew longer, the city settled into a particular quality of quiet that belongs only to this specific hour, the hour just before the first true light. It is a stillness that feels different from the stillness of midnight, deeper in some ways, softer in others, as though the city itself is in the lightest and most delicate phase of its sleep, the phase just before waking, when the mind begins to produce its most gentle and half-formed dreams. Up in the upper floors of the insula, the sleepers turned in their blankets, not waking, not quite, but shifting, adjusting, moving through the shallows of sleep the way a person moves through shallow water, feet occasionally touching the bottom. A child made a small sound and was quiet again. Someone coughed once softly, and the sound dissolved into the darkness of a room where 3 or 4 people slept together for warmth and company and the simple practicality of shared space. The embers in the small brazier had burned down to almost nothing. Just a faint orange glow at the bottom of the iron bowl, giving off the last of their warmth. Not enough to heat the room, but enough to be a presence. A small comfort, a reminder that someone had thought to provide it. The baker's first loaves were in the oven now. The smell that had been warm and promising was becoming something richer and more definite. The smell of bread actually baking. That particular sweetness that is not quite sweet. That warmth that is not quite warm in the usual sense, but is warmth nonetheless. A smell that has been recognized as good and right and nourishing by human beings for thousands of years before Rome, and would be recognized the same way for thousands of years after. It moved out through the open front of the bakery and into the street, and it drifted upward along the face of the building, past the shuttered windows of the apartments above. And if any of those sleepers were in the very lightest layer of sleep, the layer closest to waking, it might have reached them, worked itself gently into whatever they were dreaming, added itself to the texture of the night's end in a way they would not remember but might have felt as a small, unaccountable comfort. The sky above the city was changing now in a way that was no longer possible to mistake for anything other than what it was. The darkness had developed a quality of depth that it had not had at midnight. A sense of layers, the buildings visible as darker shapes against a dark that was somehow less absolute. The rooftops beginning to have edges again. Outlines, the suggestion of dimension. And at the very horizon, at the point where the hills of the city met the sky, there was the faintest intimation of something warmer than darkness. Not yet color, not yet light, but the memory of color. The promise of light held there very quietly, as though the day was in no particular hurry and was content to let the night finish at its own pace. The bakers knew this light. They had watched it come up more mornings than they could count, and it had long since ceased to be remarkable to them, the way any repeated thing eventually loses its power to surprise while retaining, if one is lucky, some residual quality of goodness. The first baker to step out of the pistrina for a moment, perhaps to stretch his back or to check on the donkeys in the small yard behind the building, would have looked up at that pale intimation of dawn the way a person looks at something familiar and quietly beloved. Without drama, without ceremony, simply acknowledging that it was there and that it was right. The city would begin to wake properly soon. The water carriers would be among the first, moving through the streets with their heavy amphorae, supplying the households in the apartment blocks that had no direct access to the fountains. A service performed early because the water was needed for the morning's cooking and washing. The street vendors who sold hot food from their thermopolia would be lighting their fires, heating the terracotta containers set into their stone counters, preparing the lentil soups and spiced wines and grain porridges that working Romans would stop to eat on their way to whatever the day required of them. The city had its own order of waking, its own sequence, and it followed that sequence with the reliability of long habit. But for just a little while longer, the majority of Rome was still asleep. The merchant who had lain awake worrying about his shipment was now finally in his deepest sleep of the night. His breathing slow and regular. His face relaxed into an expression of uncomplicated rest. The family in the third-floor apartment, the parents and the children and the grandmother who slept nearest to the window, were all still, all quiet, the small sounds of their breathing mingling together into something that was almost a kind of music. Domestic and soft. Even the dog who slept in the corridor outside had stopped twitching and lay fully surrendered to sleep. His paws still, his nose resting on the cool stone floor. The bread in the oven was nearly done. The baker would know by smell and by the particular sound the loaves made when tapped on their bottoms. A hollow sound, a sound of completion, of something that had been a process now being a thing. He would lift them out with the long wooden paddle, set them on the stone counter to cool, and already the next batch would be waiting, shaped and ready, and the work would continue in its steady and unhurried way. Because this was what the morning required, and this was what the baker provided, had always provided, would continue to provide. This most fundamental of things, bread for the waking city. And the city would wake. It was waking already in its outermost layers, in the earliest risers and the night workers finishing their shifts, and the bakers who had been up since before the stars began to fade. It would wake fully in the way it always did, gradually and then all at once, the sounds building from one to several to many, the streets filling, the voices multiplying, the whole enormous human enterprise of a great city resuming itself with the matter-of-fact energy of something that has always done this and intends to keep doing it. But that is the day, and this has been the night. This long, layered, quietly inhabited night in the apartment blocks of Rome, where so many thousands of people found their rest in small rooms and narrow beds and shared blankets and the warmth of bodies close together, where the darkness was full of the small sounds of sleeping and the distant rumble of carts and the occasional voice from the street below, where the smell of wood smoke and lamp oil and the river and the bakery all moved together through the air of a city that never entirely stopped, not even in its deepest hours. The bread is cooling on the counter. The last cart has turned toward the stable. The sky holds its pale and tender promise at the horizon. And somewhere in the upper floors of an insula on a street not far from the forum, a child is still asleep, one hand open beside her face, dreaming whatever it is that children dream. Unhurried, untroubled, held in the quiet that the night has made and is. Even now, very gently, beginning to give back to the morning.